Right now, Lake Mead is hovering only a few feet above a number that changes Hoover Dam from a monument of power into a machine approaching a hydropower cliff. The Bureau of Reclamation records show the reservoir recently near 1,044.58 feet above sea level. That sounds like an enormous wall of water still standing behind the dam. But the shocking part is not how much water remains. It is how close the system is to 1,035 feet, a threshold where older turbines are expected to suffer severe cavitation damage, and where updated federal assessments say usable capacity could fall from about 1,302 megawatts to only 382. But that is not the scariest part. The danger is not that Hoover Dam suddenly goes dry. The danger is that the dam can begin losing its most valuable function before the reservoir reaches the dramatic images people imagine. A few feet of elevation can become hundreds of megawatts. A falling shoreline can become higher electric risk across Nevada, Arizona, and California. So what does this cliff say about the future of water, power, and infrastructure in the American Southwest? If viewers care about systems that quietly hold daily life together, like, subscribe, and comment where they are watching from, because this story begins at Hoover Dam, but it does not end there. At the base of Hoover Dam, the danger does not announce itself like a disaster movie. There is no wall of water breaking through concrete. There is no single siren that tells the desert the system has crossed a line. There is only a reservoir surface sitting lower than it used to, a pale mineral ring climbing the canyon walls, and inside the dam, machines that depend on height, pressure, and timing. From the outside, Hoover still looks immovable. From the inside, every lost foot is information. The people affected by this are not only the engineers standing inside the powerhouse. They are households in Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California. They are water agencies that need electricity to move water through pumps, canals, treatment plants, and pressure systems. They are farmers who depend on the Colorado River, not as an idea, but as a scheduled delivery. They are city managers planning for hotter summers. They are grid operators trying to balance demand during the hours when air conditioners become survival equipment. They are tribal communities, desert towns, irrigation districts, and millions of customers who may never see the inside of Hoover Dam, but still live inside the consequences of its output. What is happening now is a slow collision between two reservoirs that were once treated like enormous buffers. Upstream, Lake Powell has been pushed close enough to its own power risks that federal operators have had to protect Glen Canyon Dam. Downstream, Lake Mead receives the consequences. When releases from Lake Powell are reduced to hold water in the upper reservoir, less water moves into Lake Mead. That is not a rumor. That is the operating logic the Bureau of Reclamation has described in its drought response. Protect one critical power pool, and the stress moves somewhere else. This is the part that makes the situation feel less like a single low lake and more like a system under triage. A doctor in an emergency room may stop one patient from crashing, but that does not mean the hospital is healthy. It means the emergency is being managed one vulnerable organ at a time. In the Colorado River system, Lake Powell and Lake Mead are those organs. Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam are not separate stories. They are connected by the same river, the same drought, the same legal agreements, and the same impossible arithmetic of water promised during a wetter century. The official warning is not phrased like panic. Federal agencies rarely speak that way. It appears in technical language: minimum power pool, reduced releases, probable inflow, reservoir elevation, turbine capability. But behind those calm phrases is a hard message. Lake Powell has been projected near levels where Glen Canyon Dam's power generation becomes endangered. To reduce that risk, Reclamation has discussed cutting annual releases from Lake Powell and using upstream water from Flaming Gorge to support Powell. That may help the upper dam. It may buy time. But it also means Lake Mead, already low, can be pushed closer to the level where Hoover Dam's older turbines face severe cavitation risk. This is why Hoover Dam is not merely waiting for a bad number on a chart. It is being squeezed from both directions. From above, less water may arrive. From below, the power grid still needs flexible electricity. From the side, the southwest keeps getting hotter, which raises electricity demand at the exact moments when hydropower becomes most valuable. The danger is not one dramatic failure. The danger is a narrowing corridor where every operational choice saves something by stressing something else. For the viewer, the most important thing to understand is that hydropower is not just electricity. It is controllable electricity. Solar panels produce when sunlight is available. Wind turbines produce when the atmosphere cooperates. But a hydroelectric dam can often respond quickly, increasing or reducing generation as demand changes. That flexibility matters in a region where late afternoon heat can push the grid toward its hardest hours. Hoover Dam has long served as more than a famous landmark. It has been part of the balancing muscle of the Southwest. When Lake Mead falls, that muscle weakens. The dam can still stand. Water can still pass. The river can still exist. But the power function changes. Lower water means lower hydraulic head, and hydraulic head is the vertical pressure that helps water do work. A dam does not create electricity simply because water is present. It creates electricity because water has height, weight, and a path downward through turbines. The reservoir is not just a lake, it is a battery made of elevation. That is why the scene at Hoover Dam is so deceptive. A tourist can look over the edge and still see blue water. A camera can show the concrete face and the massive towers and make everything appear secure. But the decisive question is not whether water is visible. The decisive question is whether the water is high enough to keep the machinery operating safely and efficiently. Below certain levels, the problem moves from scenery into physics. The lake may still look enormous, but the dam's ability to convert that water into power can drop sharply. The severity is therefore measured in more than shoreline. It is measured in lost head, reduced output, narrower operating choices, higher replacement costs, and greater dependence on other power sources during heat. It is measured in the difference between a dam that can help stabilize the grid and a dam that must be protected from damaging itself. The Bureau of Reclamation has warned that at 1,035 feet, older turbines at Hoover are expected to face severe cavitation damage. In plain language, that means the dam approaches a level where running parts of the machine can become dangerous to the machine itself. That is the hidden tension in the present moment. Hoover Dam was built to turn falling water into confidence. It powered cities, farms, factories, military production, suburban growth, and the mythology of a desert made manageable by engineering. But the modern Southwest is asking the same dam to operate in a different climate, under different demand, with reservoirs that no longer behave like endless savings accounts. The system still has tools. It has conservation agreements, shortage rules, new turbine investments, emergency releases, and operating plans. But those tools are not proof that the risk is gone. They are proof that the risk is now active enough to require constant management. People should care, because this is how infrastructure stress usually reaches daily life, not through one loud collapse, but through margins getting thinner. A water agency pays more to move water. A power authority buys more replacement electricity. A city faces a hotter night with less cheap, flexible power behind it. A family running an air conditioner never sees the turbine, but the turbine is part of the chain that keeps that room livable. A farmer watching an irrigation schedule never sees the federal operating table, but the operating table decides how much water is moving through the basin. And so the scene is not only Hoover Dam. The scene is the entire chain that begins in snowpack and ends inside a house at midnight. Snow falls in the Rocky Mountains, or it does not. Runoff enters Lake Powell, or it arrives too weak. Federal operators hold water upstream, or send it downstream. Lake Mead rises, or slips. Hoover's hydraulic head strengthens, or fades. Turbines spin smoothly, or enter dangerous conditions. Electricity flows, or must be replaced. A bill changes. A pump schedule changes. A grid operator loses one more cushion. That is why a few feet at Lake Mead matter far beyond the canyon. They are not just measurements on a reservoir wall. They are signals moving through a system built on the assumption that the Colorado River could be divided, stored, timed, and converted into growth. Hoover Dam is still there. The concrete is still massive. The generators have not vanished. But the operating environment around them is changing. The waterline is becoming a message. And the message is simple. The Southwest's most famous dam is no longer only a symbol of what engineering can control. It is becoming evidence of what happens when a system designed around abundance has to learn scarcity in real time. The number looks small only because the reservoir is enormous. 1,035 feet above sea level is not the bottom of Lake Mead. It is not Dead Pool. It is not the point where the Colorado River stops moving through Hoover Dam. It is not the apocalyptic image of a dry canyon with a silent concrete wall. That is exactly why it is so dangerous to misunderstand. 1,035 feet is a different kind of threshold. It is not the end of the water. It is the beginning of a power problem. At Hoover Dam, the headline number is not measured only in feet. It is measured in megawatts. Federal assessments have warned that at that lake elevation, usable Hoover capacity could fall from an earlier estimate of about 1,302 megawatts to only 382 megawatts. That is a loss of about 920 megawatts of available capacity at a single operating line. Put another way, nearly 3/4 of that estimated capability can disappear from the operating picture, not because the dam has vanished, but because the remaining water is no longer high enough for much of the older machinery to work safely. That is the cliff. And cliffs are different from slopes. On a slope, each step down feels predictable. A little less water means a little less pressure. A little less pressure means a little less power. That is the version people can easily imagine. But a cliff means the relationship changes. A few more feet can move the system from difficult to restricted, from reduced to sharply constrained, from a power plant adapting to low water into a power plant forced to protect its own turbines. The dam still looks gigantic. Lake Mead still contains a visible body of water. The intake towers still rise like stone sentinels near the face of the dam. Tourists can still stand above Black Canyon and feel that the structure belongs to a scale beyond ordinary life. But the decisive number is not what the eye sees, it is what the machine feels. The machine feels elevation. The machine feels pressure. The machine feels where the water enters at the right force, through the right path, at the right operating range, without creating the destructive turbulence that can eat metal from the inside. 1,035 feet is about 315 meters. In an ordinary building, the difference between the recent lake level and that threshold may sound like only a few floors of height. In a reservoir spread across a desert canyon, it can sound almost trivial. A person driving past apartment towers or office blocks may think of 10 feet, 15 feet, or 20 feet as a local detail. At Hoover Dam, that same vertical difference is translated through penstocks, turbines, generators, contracts, and the regional grid. That is the strange scale of hydropower. Horizontal size can mislead. Lake Mead can stretch across a vast landscape and still be losing the vertical dimension that matters most. A shallow pan and a deep glass can hold the same amount of water, but only one can send that water downward with force. Hoover Dam does not need water merely to exist. It needs water stacked high enough to become pressure. The reservoir is not only storage, it is height stored as energy. The old promise of Hoover was built on that height. The Colorado River was stopped, lifted, and turned into a controlled fall. That fall became electricity. For decades, the public image of the dam focused on magnitude, concrete, steel, rock, volume, engineering confidence. But the modern risk is not a lack of size, it is a loss of margin. The system can look large, while the safe operating band becomes narrow. A useful comparison is a phone battery. A phone at 100% feels different from a phone at 20%, but it still works. Then the last few percent change behavior. The screen dims. Apps slow. The device begins protecting itself. At 1%, the phone has not physically disappeared, but it no longer offers the same reliability. Lake Mead above Hoover Dam is not a phone, and a dam is far more complex than a device in a hand. But the principle of hidden thresholds is similar. A system can lose function before it reaches zero. That is what makes the headline number so disturbing. The public imagination often waits for dead pool because dead pool sounds final, but hydropower has its own earlier warning lines. The river can still pass through the dam. Water deliveries can still be made through different outlets. The reservoir can still hold water. Yet the power plant can enter a zone where the most valuable form of output, flexible electricity, is no longer available at the scale expected. The arithmetic is blunt. Hoover power plant has 17 main turbines. Historically, the plant has carried a nameplate capacity just over 2,000 megawatts. That number helped make Hoover one of the great hydroelectric symbols of the United States. But nameplate capacity is not the same thing as usable capacity under low reservoir conditions. Nameplate is what the facility can produce under design assumptions. Usable capacity is what the facility can realistically and safely provide under the water level, mechanical condition, and operating rules of the moment. That distinction matters because it is where public misunderstanding begins. A person may hear that Hoover Dam is a 2,000 megawatt class facility and assume that the machine remains basically the same until the lake is almost empty. But the turbine room does not operate by reputation. It operates by physics. As the lake falls, the hydraulic head falls. As the hydraulic head falls, the older turbines are pushed closer to conditions where damage becomes unacceptable. Eventually, operators must stop treating every turbine as equally available. This is why 1,035 feet changes everything. At that point, according to federal technical assessments, Hoover would depend much more heavily on the wide head turbines, the machines designed to tolerate lower lake elevations. The older turbines, by contrast, face severe cavitation risk. The dam still has water, it still has generators, it still has transmission connections, but the fleet inside the powerhouse is no longer one uniform fleet. It becomes a divided machine, with some units still capable of working, and others increasingly dangerous to run. The difference between 1,302 megawatts and 382 megawatts is not an abstract engineering note. It is the equivalent of removing a large power plant from the regional balance sheet. The lost capacity is larger than many gas-fired plants. It is larger than the load of entire towns during ordinary hours. During summer peaks, when air conditioners run across desert cities and the grid becomes tight, that missing flexibility can force power agencies to find replacements elsewhere, and replacement is not neutral. Replacing lost hydropower may mean buying more expensive power on the market. It may mean relying more heavily on gas generation during high-demand hours. It may mean leaning harder on batteries, imports, conservation alerts, or demand response programs. None of that means the lights automatically go out. That would be too crude, and the evidence does not support that kind of panic. The real danger is quieter. The system loses a cheap, fast, familiar tool. At the same time, heat is increasing the need for fast tools. This is where the number becomes human. A megawatt is not something a person can hold in a hand, but it can become the air conditioner in an apartment where an older resident is trying to sleep through a hot night. It can become the pump moving treated water uphill. It can become the refrigerated warehouse keeping food safe. It can become the traffic signal, the hospital cooling system, the school district utility bill, the water treatment plant, the irrigation pump, the public agency budget. Electricity is invisible until it becomes unavailable or expensive. Then it becomes everything. The headline number also reveals why Lake Mead's decline is not only a water story, it is a timing story. The Southwest needs water when drought reduces supply. It needs power when heat raises demand. It needs storage when snowpack and runoff become less predictable. And it needs old infrastructure to perform under conditions that look less like the 20th century climate used to plan it. 1,035 feet is therefore not just an elevation, it is a meeting point between climate, engineering, law, finance, and daily life. There is another reason this threshold is unusual. Most people understand shortage as a gradual scarcity of a resource. Less water means less water. But Hoover shows that infrastructure can turn gradual scarcity into sudden functional loss. The reservoir may fall by inches or feet, but the operational consequence can arrive in a block. A unit becomes unavailable. A set of turbines becomes risky. A projected capacity number drops. A power customer sees future costs differently. A dam that once turned uncertainty into confidence starts transmitting uncertainty downstream. That is the deeper shock behind the headline. The number does not say that Hoover Dam is about to collapse. It says something more precise, and in some ways more important. The dam can remain physically strong while the system around it becomes less capable. Concrete can be intact. Transmission lines can be standing. Operators can be skilled. But if the reservoir loses enough elevation, the power plant loses the pressure range that gives those machines their purpose. A few feet, then, are not just a few feet. They are the difference between water as scenery and water as force. They are the distance between a dam that can answer the grid and a dam that has to protect its own heart. They are a vertical countdown written on the walls of Lake Mead, where each pale band of exposed rock records not only drought, but the shrinking headroom of an entire system. The mistake is to look at Lake Mead and ask only one question. How much water is left? That question feels obvious. It is the question that fits the images. A falling lake, a white bathtub ring, boat ramps ending in dust, intake towers standing higher above the surface than they once did. When people see a reservoir shrinking, they imagine a simple countdown to empty. More water means safety. Less water means danger. No water means failure. But Hoover Dam's hydropower cliff is not built around empty. It is built around cavitation. That is the part most people miss, because cavitation does not look like a shoreline. It does not show up as a dramatic crack in the dam. It does not create a single photograph that explains the danger in one frame. Cavitation happens inside the machine, in the violent meeting place between water, pressure, spinning metal, and speed. It is hidden in the turbine runner, in the flow path, in the places where water is supposed to move smoothly, but begins to behave like a weapon. In simple terms, cavitation begins when pressure drops low enough for tiny vapor bubbles to form inside moving water. These are not ordinary air bubbles drifting harmlessly upward in a glass. They are pockets of vapor born in a pressure collapse. Then, when those bubbles move into a zone of higher pressure, they implode. They collapse so quickly and so violently that their energy is concentrated into microscopic impacts. One bubble is tiny. Millions of bubbles, striking again and again, become a hammer. That hammer does not swing from the outside. It swings inside the water itself. On turbine metal, cavitation can create pitting, erosion, vibration, roughness, efficiency loss, and eventually damage serious enough that operators cannot treat the machine as safely available. It can make a polished surface become scarred. It can make a turbine that once turned water into electricity begin losing its own skin. The frightening part is not that the turbine explodes in an instant. The frightening part is that a machine designed for controlled force begins being attacked by the very fluid that powers it. This is why the story is not simply that Lake Mead is low. The deeper story is that Lake Mead is approaching a level where water still exists. But the pressure conditions around older turbines become dangerous. That distinction changes everything. If the public waits for the lake to approach dead pool before taking the power risk seriously, it is waiting for the wrong line. The hydropower cliff arrives earlier. The machine has limits before the reservoir reaches the bottom. At 1,035 feet, the Bureau of Reclamation's updated technical assessment says older Hoover turbines are expected to face severe cavitation damage. That sentence is calm, but it contains a hard warning. It does not say the dam has no water. It does not say the concrete has failed. It says the old machinery can no longer be assumed to operate safely in the same way. The danger is not absence. The danger is bad geometry, low head, pressure instability, and the wrong turbine operating in the wrong hydraulic conditions. That is why the phrase hydropower cliff is so precise. A cliff is not just a decline. A cliff is a point where the ground changes shape beneath the system. Above the threshold, Hoover can still be reduced, stressed, weakened, but broadly understood as a functioning power plant with a known fleet of generators. At the threshold, the older machines become a liability. Below it, the question changes from how much power can be made to which machines can be used without damaging themselves. This is the hidden mechanism behind the headline numbers. Hoover Dam does not lose most of its usable capacity because the reservoir suddenly disappears. It loses capacity because 12 older turbines are not designed for the low water conditions expected below that elevation. If those units must be restricted or taken offline, the dam becomes dependent on the smaller group of wide-head turbines, which are built to work across a broader range of water levels. The power plant remains alive, but it is no longer the same animal. It becomes a wounded animal leaning on its stronger limbs. The image matters. A person might imagine Hoover Dam as a giant concrete plug holding back a lake. But for hydropower, the dam is closer to a massive instrument, and Lake Mead is the pressure that lets the instrument play. The penstocks are its airways, the turbines are its lungs and heart, the generators are its voice. When the lake drops, the instrument does not simply get quieter in a smooth, predictable way. At a certain point, some notes become dangerous to play. Push them too hard, and the instrument damages itself. Cavitation is that bad note. It is not spectacular from the outside. That is what makes it so unsettling. A tourist could stand near the dam and see order, scale, and continuity. The massive intake towers still stand. The transmission lines still cross the desert. The powerhouse still exists. But inside the hydraulic system, the operating envelope is shrinking. A machine that once had room to breathe is being pushed toward the edge of its design. There is a human path through this mechanism. It begins as low snowpack and reduced runoff in the Colorado River Basin. It moves into Lake Powell, Lake Mead, and federal operating decisions. It becomes a lower reservoir elevation at Hoover Dam. That lower elevation becomes reduced hydraulic head. Reduced head changes how water enters the turbine. The changed flow raises cavitation risk in older units. Operators respond by limiting or avoiding those units. The power plant produces less flexible electricity. Utilities replace that power somewhere else. Replacement costs move into budgets, contracts, and bills. Finally, the mechanism reaches a home during a hot evening when an air conditioner runs longer and the grid has one less familiar cushion. That is the route from atmosphere to metal to household. And it is why this story is more disturbing than a simple low lake story. A lake can be measured. A falling shoreline can be photographed. But a shrinking operating envelope is harder to see. It exists in engineering charts, risk models, maintenance schedules, and dispatch decisions. It becomes visible only when the system has already lost options. The old assumption was that Hoover had more room than this. Lake Mead's minimum power pool is much lower than 1,035 feet. For years, that deeper number shaped the public imagination. It suggested that hydropower risk was distant, farther down the canyon wall, beyond the immediate crisis. But cavitation moves the warning line upward. It tells a different story. It says the practical limit for much of the older machinery may arrive while the reservoir still appears far from the final bottom. That is the overlooked part. Not dead pool, damage pool. Not the absence of water, the wrong kind of water pressure. Not a dry dam. A dam forced to protect its own turbines. The distinction is not wordplay. It is infrastructure, reality. Modern society often assumes that systems fail only when the main resource disappears. A water system fails when there is no water. A power system fails when there is no fuel. A road fails when it is washed out. But many real systems weaken earlier, when a narrow component crosses a threshold. A transformer overheats before the entire grid collapses. A hospital fills before every patient is untreated. A drainage pipe backs up before a city is underwater. A turbine enters cavitation risk before the reservoir is empty. Hoover Dam's small part is the turbine runner. Its hidden enemy is the collapsing bubble. Its warning line is not the bottom of Lake Mead, but the elevation at which old machinery begins to face conditions it was not built to endure. This is what turns the story from drought into system risk. Water managers can still move water. Engineers can still upgrade turbines. Grid planners can still model replacement power. None of that is denial. Those are real tools. But the tools are being used because the margin has changed. The Colorado River system is no longer simply deciding how to distribute abundance. It is learning how to keep aging infrastructure useful, while the physical conditions around it move outside the old comfort zone. And so the most important sound at Hoover Dam may not be the roar of water through concrete. It may be the sound no visitor hears. The microscopic collapse of vapor bubbles against metal, repeated over and over in a place where pressure has fallen too far. That is the sound of a hidden threshold. That is the sound of a system discovering that water can still be present and still no longer be enough. The central mechanism has a simple name, but a brutal consequence. It is hydraulic head. Hydraulic head means the vertical distance and pressure that allow water to do work. At Hoover Dam, the water behind the dam is not valuable to electricity only because it is wet, or because there is a lot of it, or because it sits in a famous reservoir. It is valuable because it sits high. Height becomes pressure. Pressure becomes motion. Motion becomes rotation. Rotation becomes electricity. The whole power plant is built around that conversion, from stored elevation to usable current. The Bureau of Reclamation explains the basic process in plain terms. Water moves through large pipes inside the dam, strikes a turbine, spins a shaft, and that shaft rotates magnets past copper coils inside a generator. The moving magnetic field creates electricity. That is the visible simplicity of hydropower. Water falls. A wheel turns. Power flows, but Hoover's problem is hidden inside the word falls. The water has to fall with enough force, through the right route, at the right pressure, across machinery designed for a particular operating range. Hoover Dam does not simply pour water through a hole and collect electricity at the other end. The reservoir feeds intake towers. The intake towers connect to huge pressure tunnels and penstocks. Those penstocks deliver water to Francis turbines, a type of turbine designed for medium to high head hydropower. Inside those turbines, water does not behave like a calm stream. It arrives under pressure, is guided through adjustable gates, strikes curved blades, gives up energy, and exits toward the river below. A Francis turbine is like a carefully shaped metal lung. Water enters around it, is directed inward, turns the runner, and leaves downward. Every curve matters. Every angle matters. Every pressure zone matters. The machine is not just strong, it is tuned. Its shape assumes that water will arrive within a certain range of force. When the reservoir is high, the turbine can breathe deeply. When the reservoir falls, the breath shortens. That shortened breath is what Lake Mead is now writing onto Hoover Dam. In a full system, the water surface behind the dam sits high above the river below. That vertical difference pushes water through the penstocks with enormous energy. In Reclamation's own Hoover facts, the turbines historically operate under heads measured in hundreds of feet. That number is not decoration. It is the height of the invisible engine. The higher the reservoir, the more pressure presses into the intake. The lower the reservoir, the weaker the push. At first, this seems manageable. Less head means less power. The turbine may still turn. The generator may still produce. Operators may adjust flow, dispatch fewer units, or generate at different times. In a normal range, the system can adapt. That is why low water does not immediately mean failure. But adaptation has boundaries. As Lake Mead falls, operators may need to move more water through a turbine to produce the same amount of electricity, or they may accept less output from the same unit. The machine can be asked to operate farther from its most efficient point. The flow angle changes. Pressure drops form in places they should not. The smooth transfer of energy becomes less smooth. The turbine is still spinning, but the water around it becomes more unstable. This is where hydraulic head becomes the bridge between drought and damage. A lower lake does not walk into the powerhouse as a crack in concrete. It arrives as altered pressure inside steel. It arrives as a changed relationship between intake elevation, penstock pressure, wicket gate opening, turbine blade angle, and downstream flow. It arrives in the operating envelope, the safe zone where a machine can run without hurting itself. Every turbine has one. At Hoover, the older turbines were built and upgraded for a world where Lake Mead was expected to provide a wider margin of head more often. A lower reservoir pushes those older machines toward the edge of their envelope. The phrase operating envelope sounds technical, but it is easy to picture. A human body can walk comfortably in a broad range of temperatures. Then heat rises. The body can still work, but it sweats harder. Then the night stays hot. The heart works harder. Sleep weakens. Medication matters. Age matters. At a certain point, the body has not disappeared, but the safe range has narrowed. The system is still alive, yet the margin is gone. A turbine has a version of that story. It can work across a range, but not across every range. Push it too far into low head conditions, and the flow can produce cavitation. Cavitation is the collapse of vapor bubbles against metal. In the turbine, those collapses are tiny, repeated impacts that can pit and erode surfaces. They can turn smooth metal into damaged metal. They can reduce efficiency, raise vibration, increase maintenance, and force operators to stop using a unit that would otherwise appear available on paper. This is why Hoover's future is not controlled only by the amount of water in Lake Mead. It is controlled by the match between water elevation and turbine design. That is also why wide head turbines matter so much. A wide head turbine is not magic. It does not create water. It does not refill Lake Mead. It does not solve the Colorado River shortage. It cannot reverse a hotter atmosphere or replace snowpack that never arrives. But it changes the shape of the operating envelope. It gives the dam machinery that can tolerate a wider range of reservoir elevations, especially lower elevations, without excessive damage. In a system where a few feet can separate normal operations from severe cavitation risk, that wider envelope becomes a form of survival. The Bureau of Reclamation has said that part of its recent Hoover Dam reliability investment will be used to replace up to 3 older turbines with wide head turbines. Those turbines are designed to operate effectively below the 1,035-foot line, and Reclamation says they can continue operating near 950 feet without excessive damage. That is a crucial detail. It means the fix is not cosmetic. It targets the specific weak link between falling water levels and power loss. The weak link is not the dam wall. It is not the transmission tower. It is not even the reservoir in the broadest sense. The weak link is the interaction between low water and turbine geometry. That is the small part that can change the system. In a region watching climate, water, and electricity collide, a turbine blade becomes more than a piece of metal. It becomes a hinge between the old Southwest and the new one. On one side of that hinge is the Hoover Dam. People learn to imagine massive, dependable, almost permanent. On the other side is Hoover under declining reservoir elevations, where power capacity depends on whether old runners can survive the pressure conditions created by a shrinking lake. The mechanism moves outward from there. If the wide head turbines restore at least 160 megawatts of capacity, as Reclamation expects, that electricity is not just a number in a technical report. It is flexibility during hot hours. It is a little more confidence for power customers in Nevada, Arizona, and California. It is a little more ability to use water, already passing through the system, to support the grid instead of replacing that power from somewhere else. It is also an admission. The old equipment is being adapted because the old water regime can no longer be assumed. Hydropower sounds clean and simple because the fuel is water, but the real fuel is water in the right place at the right height. A river flowing at the wrong elevation cannot provide the same service. A reservoir holding water too low cannot push with the same force. A dam with turbines outside their safe range cannot pretend that nameplate capacity is the same as available capacity. That distinction is now one of the most important facts in the Southwest. A person sitting in an apartment in Las Vegas, Phoenix, or Southern California does not experience hydraulic head directly. That person experiences heat, bills, and reliability. But the chain is real. The Rocky Mountains store winter moisture. Spring runoff moves into the Colorado River system. Federal operators manage Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Lake Mead's elevation sets the pressure at Hoover. Pressure sets turbine performance. Turbine performance shapes power availability. Power availability affects utilities. Utilities affect homes. The mechanism passes through everything, from snow into river, from river into reservoir, from reservoir into penstock, from penstock into turbine, from turbine into copper, from copper into transmission lines, from transmission lines into a room where someone is trying to keep the temperature safe enough to sleep. That is why the explanation cannot remain inside the dam. The physics is technical, but the consequence is social. Hydraulic head decides whether Hoover can still act like a fast, flexible source of power when the Southwest is under stress. Cavitation decides whether older turbines can be run or must be spared. Wide head turbines decide whether the dam can keep producing at lower lake levels without destroying the parts that make production possible. The larger story is not that engineering has failed. In fact, the wide head upgrade shows engineering trying to respond. It is a targeted adaptation, a way to keep a critical machine useful in a harsher operating environment. But adaptation also reveals the pressure. No one spends tens of millions of dollars replacing turbine technology at a world-famous dam because everything is normal. The investment is a signal that the baseline has moved. Hoover Dam was built to capture falling water. The new challenge is that the water is still falling, but from a lower starting point. That lower starting point weakens the force, narrows the safe range, and forces the system to choose which machines can still work. The dam remains immense, the river remains powerful, the engineering remains impressive, but the mechanism is unforgiving. Hydropower is not made by water alone, it is made by height. And when height disappears 1 foot at a time, the machine does not wait for the lake to be empty before it starts telling the truth. Hoover Dam was never just a building. It was a bet. The bet was that a violent river could be measured, divided, stored, lowered through turbines, and turned into a predictable foundation for cities and farms. In the early 20th century, that bet looked almost unstoppable. Concrete rose in Black Canyon. Steel runners were lowered into place. Transmission lines crossed the desert. Water that once carved canyons was turned into contracts, crops, subdivisions, lights, pumps, and political confidence. Hoover Dam became one of the great symbols of the age, when infrastructure promised to make nature legible. But every symbol has a hidden assumption. For Hoover, the assumption was that the river behind it would remain reliable enough, often enough, to keep the whole bargain working. The dam could survive dry years. The reservoir could absorb swings. The river could be regulated. The system could wait out bad seasons and return to something close to normal. That assumption is now the historical artifact. The warning did not begin with the latest drop in Lake Mead. It appeared over years. In receding shorelines, emergency operating plans, shortage declarations, falling power projections, and the slow realization that the Colorado River system was not facing one bad year. It was facing a changed baseline. The past was not repeating itself. The past was being used as a ruler for a river that no longer fit the ruler. Lake Mead itself has already lived through this transformation. For much of its modern history, it was imagined as a giant reserve, the lower basin's great savings account. When the reservoir was high, the scale of it created a sense of permanence. There was so much water that the system seemed protected from political failure, engineering failure, and climatic surprise. The white mineral ring that now scars the canyon wall is the record of that illusion fading. It is not merely a mark of low water, it is a timeline of confidence draining out of the system. Then came the parallel warning, upstream at Lake Powell. Lake Powell and Lake Mead are often described separately, as if one belongs to Glen Canyon Dam and the other belongs to Hoover Dam. But in the real river system, they are paired organs. Lake Powell stores water above the Grand Canyon. Lake Mead stores water below it. If Powell is protected by holding more water upstream, Mead can suffer downstream. If Mead is protected by sending more water down, Powell can approach its own power danger. The two reservoirs are connected not only by water, but by trade-offs. This is the precedent that matters most. Federal operators have already had to confront the possibility that Glen Canyon Dam could approach minimum power pool, the elevation below which power generation becomes endangered. The Bureau of Reclamation warned that extremely low inflow into Lake Powell could push that reservoir toward levels where the dam's turbines would be at risk. The agency described inflow forecasts far below historical averages and discussed emergency actions, including reduced releases and water moved from Flaming Gorge Reservoir to support Powell. That was not a theoretical exercise. It was a live demonstration of triage. To protect one hydropower facility, the system considered holding water upstream. But water held upstream is water not arriving downstream. The consequence can move toward Lake Mead. And when Lake Mead falls toward 1,035 feet, Hoover Dam begins approaching its own turbine problem. In other words, the system is now capable of passing risk from one dam to another, like a fever moving through a body. This is the historical break. The reservoirs were built to buffer risk. Now, in low water conditions, they can also transfer risk. A previous generation saw the big dams as a chain of security. Lake Powell and Lake Mead together were supposed to provide time, storage, control, and stability. They still provide those things. But under sustained aridification, the chain does not simply protect. It tightens. Every decision changes pressure somewhere else. A foot saved at one reservoir can become a foot lost at another. A turbine protected in one canyon can mean a turbine threatened in another canyon. A release schedule becomes a system-wide moral and mechanical calculation. The scientific record makes clear why this cannot be dismissed as bad luck alone. The Southwest has been living through one of the most severe, long, dry periods in the known record. A research spotlight from the National Integrated Drought Information System described a UCLA-led study finding that the 22-year southwestern North American megadrought was the driest in at least 1,200 years. That does not mean every dry month has the same cause. It does not mean natural variability disappeared, but it does mean the recent past has been extreme enough to demand a different level of seriousness. Another study focused on the Colorado River Basin's snowpack regions found that human-caused warming has reduced natural flow by roughly 10% compared with a cooler climate. That finding is important because it connects temperature to water supply through a mechanism, not just through a slogan. Warmer air increases evaporation. Warmer soils hold less moisture for runoff. Snowpack melts differently. Plants and landscapes demand more water. A basin can receive precipitation and still send less of it into the river. Heat turns water into absence before the river ever sees it. That is the part history did not prepare the system to handle. The old river management problem was how to allocate water among competing users. The new problem is how to operate a fully allocated river as the physical supply shrinks and the demand for electricity rises during heat. That is not one crisis. It is two crises braided together. Water shortage weakens hydropower. Heat raises power demand. Lower hydropower forces replacements. Replacements may cost more. Higher costs move through cities, farms, agencies, and households. The river does not merely lose volume. It loses reliability. Hoover Dam has seen drought before. The Colorado River has always been variable. Wet years and dry years are part of the basin's natural history. That must be said clearly, because exaggeration would weaken the truth. This is not a claim that the river was ever simple, stable, or obedient. It never was. The Colorado has always been a difficult river to govern, but the current danger is not ordinary variability alone. It is variability loaded on top of warming, overuse, legal rigidity, population growth, agricultural demand, and infrastructure designed around a different expectation of water. That combination is what turns a low reservoir into a systemic warning. A dry year can be endured. A dry decade can be managed with pain. But a hotter baseline changes the meaning of every dry year that follows. A useful past comparison is not a single broken dam. It is the way Lake Powell's power risk forced operators to think about emergency support before the reservoir reached the public's imagined endpoint. The dam did not need to collapse for the system to enter crisis management. It only needed to approach a power threshold. That is the same pattern now haunting Hoover. The concrete can remain strong while the operating assumptions weaken. The reservoir can contain water while the turbine margin collapses. The public can see a functioning dam while the power planners see a narrowing set of choices. This is how modern infrastructure reveals age, not by suddenly becoming useless, but by meeting conditions outside its design comfort zone more often. A bridge built for older flood assumptions faces new rainfall intensity. A drainage system built for past storms backs up under present storms. A hospital designed for normal heat sees night after night of emergency demand. A dam built for a certain range of reservoir behavior finds that the lake no longer visits the old high levels, often enough to preserve the old confidence. Hoover's precedent, then, is not only Glen Canyon Dam. It is every system where climate pressure finds the small part that cannot adjust fast enough. At Hoover, that part is the older turbine fleet. At Glen Canyon, it is the minimum power pool and the intake elevation. In cities, it may be transformers during heat waves. In agriculture, it may be the planting window. In water delivery, it may be the pump station. The pattern is the same. Climate stress rarely breaks everything at once. It finds the hinge. It finds the joint. It finds the piece that was adequate under the old normal and marginal under the new one. History makes the current moment harder to ignore because it shows a sequence rather than an accident. First, the basin enters a long dry period. Then reservoirs decline. Then shortage rules activate. Then emergency operations appear. Then upstream protection affects downstream storage. Then hydropower thresholds move from obscure technical documents into the public conversation. Finally, Hoover Dam, the great symbol of engineered certainty, approaches a line where a few feet of water can mean hundreds of megawatts of power. That is not imagination. That is precedent becoming present. The past warning was Lake Powell nearing its own power danger. The present warning is Lake Mead approaching Hoover's turbine cliff. The future warning may be something else in the same chain. A hotter grid, a harder water cut, a smaller agricultural buffer, a cost increase that lands on people who never thought about reservoir elevation in their lives. And that is why the history matters. It shows that the Hoover Dam story is not a surprise bolt from nowhere. It is a chapter in a longer record of a river system, discovering that storage alone cannot erase a changed climate, and engineering alone cannot preserve an old promise, unless the operating assumptions are rewritten with the same seriousness that built the dam in the first place. The vulnerable layer of this story does not sit only inside Hoover Dam, it sits inside bills. That is where the hydropower cliff becomes personal. Not as a single blackout, not as a dramatic failure of concrete, not as a scene where the river stops moving. It becomes personal when a public utility has to replace power it expected to receive from Hoover. It becomes personal when replacement electricity costs more. It becomes personal when those costs move through water agencies, irrigation districts, cities, and eventually homes. A turbine under stress becomes a budget under stress. A falling lake becomes a line item. The people most exposed are not always the people closest to the dam. Some live in the desert cities that grew around the promise of managed water and managed electricity. Some live in older apartment buildings where cooling is inefficient. Some live in tribal communities and rural towns where infrastructure already carries decades of underinvestment. Some are farmers watching energy costs, water allocations, and crop margins tighten at the same time. Some are elderly residents who do not care where electricity comes from until a hot night turns a room into a medical risk. Hoover power is spread across a wide map. The Bureau of Reclamation lists firm energy allocations to Arizona, Nevada, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, Los Angeles, Southern California Edison, Boulder City, and other California cities including Burbank, Glendale, Pasadena, Anaheim, Riverside, Vernon, Azusa, Banning, and Colton. Those names matter because they show that Hoover is not an isolated monument. It is wired into institutions that move water, cool buildings, operate public services, and balance budgets across the lower Colorado River region. This is the first fragile layer, the customer network. For decades, Hoover Hydropower has been valuable not only because it is electricity, but because it has historically been low-cost, federal, and predictable. In a fast-growing region, that kind of power became part of planning. It helped agencies think in long time horizons. It helped cities treat the dam as a reliable piece of the public machine. But when generation declines, the financial structure feels the impact. Reclamation has warned that unprecedented drought has already reduced Hoover generation by about 30%, and that further declines could add pressure to customer rates. That sentence should be read slowly. Customer rates are where engineering risk meets ordinary life. A megawatt lost inside the powerhouse does not stay inside the powerhouse. It leaves as a procurement problem. The utility still has customers. The water agency still has pumps. The city still has streetlights, treatment plants, public buildings, emergency services, and air-conditioned shelters. When Hoover produces less, the missing energy must be replaced. Some of that replacement may come from market purchases. Some may come from gas plants. Some may come from batteries, solar, imports, conservation programs, or demand response. The mix can change, but the pressure remains. A cheap, flexible source has weakened. The second fragile layer is timing. Hydropower is most valuable when the grid needs quick response. It can ramp. It can help balance variable generation. It can support the evening hours when solar fades and demand remains high. That timing matters in the Southwest because extreme heat is not just uncomfortable. It is an electrical event. On hot afternoons and evenings, millions of air conditioners run at once. Buildings release stored heat. Pavement radiates warmth. Older people, outdoor workers, infants, and people with chronic illness face greater danger when nighttime temperatures fail to drop. In that moment, electricity is not a luxury. It is part of the public health system. So the Hoover risk is more serious than the headline megawatt number. The headline says capacity falls. The hidden layer asks when that capacity is needed, who replaces it, who pays for replacement, and who has the least ability to absorb higher costs. A wealthy household may barely notice a small bill increase. A public agency may pass costs through slowly. A low-income family may face a sharper choice: cooling the home, buying food, paying rent, paying medical bills. All those pressures meet in the same monthly envelope. The hydropower cliff does not arrive at that door with the word cavitation written on it. It arrives as another increase, another warning, another reminder that the systems behind comfort are not equally felt by everyone. The third fragile layer is water pumping. The Colorado River is not only consumed by gravity, it is moved, lifted, treated, and pressurized. Southern California depends on immense water infrastructure, including agencies that use power to deliver water across distance and elevation. Cities across the region need electricity to run wells, pump stations, treatment plants, waste. When electricity becomes more expensive or less reliable, water systems can feel it. When water systems pay more, customers can feel it again. This creates a loop. The river produces hydropower. That power supports agencies that help move water. Low water reduces hydropower. Reduced hydropower can increase costs for systems that depend on power to handle water. The river's stress returns to the river's users through a different door. The fourth fragile layer is agriculture. In the Colorado River Basin, agriculture is not an abstract category. It is fields, labor, equipment, loans, contracts, packing facilities, cold storage, and seasonal decisions made before harvest is certain. A farmer does not only need water, a farmer needs predictable timing. Electricity runs pumps, refrigeration, processing, and distribution. Fuel, fertilizer, labor, water, and power costs can all move together in painful ways. If hydropower declines while water uncertainty rises, the farm is squeezed from both sides. The mechanism can travel through a single crop. A lower snowpack means weaker runoff. Weaker runoff affects reservoir operations. Reservoir operations shape water deliveries and hydropower output. Lower hydropower output affects electricity costs. Electricity costs affect pumping and refrigeration. Pumping and refrigeration affect farm income. Farm income affects payroll, debt, and what reaches the market. By the time a shopper sees a price, the original signal from Lake Mead has passed through mountains, reservoirs, turbines, contracts, and human labor. That is how a reservoir elevation becomes food system pressure. The fifth fragile layer is institutional. Hoover Dam is bound by contracts, laws, allocations, and repayment structures. Power customers are not simply buying an interchangeable product from a shelf. They are part of a long-built public power arrangement tied to the Boulder Canyon project. Revenues from power help support the system. If generation falls far enough, long-term, financial viability becomes a concern. Reclamation's warning about customer rates is therefore not just about electricity markets. It is about the economic engine that helps keep the infrastructure functioning. This matters because infrastructure can enter a vicious cycle. Lower output means less revenue or more expensive replacement. More financial stress can make maintenance and modernization more difficult. Delayed modernization can leave the system more vulnerable to the next low water period. That does not mean collapse is inevitable, but it means the danger is cumulative. The system can be damaged not only by one bad year, but by repeated years that eat away at financial and mechanical resilience. The sixth fragile layer is trust. People trust invisible systems until those systems begin behaving unpredictably. They trust that water will come from the tap. They trust that air conditioning will work during heat. They trust that a public agency has planned for the future. They trust that a famous dam will keep doing what it has always done. When Lake Mead approaches a threshold where older turbines cannot be safely relied upon, that trust is not destroyed overnight. It is thinned. It becomes conditional. It begins to require explanations that did not used to be necessary, and the explanation is uncomfortable. Hoover Dam is not failing because it was poorly built. It is being stressed because the environment around it is changing and the demands placed upon it remain high. That is a more disturbing message than incompetence. Incompetence can be fixed by replacing a manager. A changed baseline requires replacing assumptions. The most vulnerable part of the system may therefore be the expectation that the past still describes the future. A dam built in the 20th century is being asked to support a 21st century grid, a hotter climate, larger metropolitan areas, constrained water supplies, and an increasingly complex mix of power resources. The old dam still has enormous value. The new wide-head turbines are an example of adaptation. They can expand the safe operating range and restore some capacity under low water conditions. But even that upgrade proves the point. The system now needs new machinery because the old reservoir behavior can no longer be taken for granted. This is why the hydropower cliff is more dangerous than the public image of it. The danger is not only a falling number on a federal chart. It is the way that number passes through layered vulnerability. First, it touches hydraulic head. Then, it touches turbine safety. Then, it touches available capacity. Then, it touches power contracts. Then it touches replacement costs. Then it touches agencies, cities, farms, and homes. By the time it reaches a person, it may no longer look like Lake Mead at all. It may look like a higher bill, a conservation notice, a budget shortfall, a delayed repair, or a hotter room. That is the part that should stay with the viewer. The weak point is not always where the public looks. At Hoover, the weak point is not the monumental concrete face. It is the older turbine operating under low head. In the regional system, the weak point may not be total electricity supply. It may be cheap, flexible power during the hours when heat makes flexibility most valuable. In a household, the weak point may not be awareness of drought. It may be the ability to pay for cooling when every other cost is rising. The hydropower cliff is therefore not just an engineering threshold, it is a social threshold. It separates a world where low water is a distant reservoir image from a world where low water changes the cost and reliability of daily life. And once that connection is visible, Hoover Dam looks different. It is no longer only a masterpiece of concrete and steel. It is a mirror showing how a few feet of water can expose the people, budgets, machines, and assumptions standing behind the dam. Hoover Dam is no longer only a dam story, it is a system test. That is the larger meaning of the hydropower cliff. A single lake elevation near 1,035 feet can look like a technical detail, something for engineers, operators, and federal planners to debate in reports. But the number reaches far beyond Black Canyon, because Hoover sits inside one of the most important linked systems in North America. It is water storage, electricity generation, city growth, agricultural production, tribal rights, international obligation, ecological stress, and climate pressure, all meeting at the same concrete wall. The Colorado River is often called the lifeblood of the American West, but that phrase can become too familiar. It should be made physical again. The river supports municipal water for more than 40 million people. It supports millions of acres of farmland. It serves 30 tribal nations and communities in Mexico. It helps generate hydropower across 7 states. It feeds cities, alfalfa fields, orchards, vegetable farms, suburbs, reservoirs, canals, pumping plants, wetlands, and power grids. This is not just a river. It is a long machine made of water, law, concrete, snow, politics, and heat. Hoover Dam is one of the places where that machine reveals itself. When Lake Mead drops, the first image is local. The shoreline retreats, the bathtub ring grows, the intake towers look taller. But the system meaning is regional. A lower Lake Mead can indicate reduced storage for water users, reduced hydraulic head for power generation, reduced flexibility for operations, and reduced confidence for a basin that has already spent years negotiating shortage. The reservoir is not a backdrop. It is a dashboard. And right now, the dashboard is not showing one warning light. It is showing several. The first warning light is climate. The Colorado River Basin was divided and developed during a period that gave decision-makers a misleading sense of available water. The legal and engineering system was built around expectations that no longer match the hotter, drier conditions that now shape runoff. A warmer atmosphere does not need to steal every storm to change a river. It can take water slowly, through evaporation, thirsty soils, earlier melt, and landscapes that hold moisture instead of sending it downstream. The river can receive snow and still deliver less water to reservoirs. The second warning light is infrastructure. Hoover Dam, Glen Canyon Dam, canals, aqueducts, pumps, and reservoirs were created to turn variability into control. They still do that. They remain extraordinary works of engineering. But infrastructure is not timeless just because it is large. Every structure carries assumptions inside it. Assumptions about flow, assumptions about demand, assumptions about operating ranges, assumptions about emergencies that are rare enough to be exceptional. When those emergencies become repeated, the old design margins become smaller. The third warning light is governance. The Colorado River is not operated by physics alone. It is operated by rules, agreements, priorities, compacts, court decisions, federal actions, state negotiations, tribal water rights, and international commitments. That legal structure can provide order, but it can also slow change. When the hydrology shifts faster than the agreements, every operational decision becomes heavier. Holding water in Lake Powell to protect Glen Canyon Dam can reduce water reaching Lake Mead. Protecting Lake Mead can stress upstream storage. Reducing use can protect the system. But the burden of reduction becomes a political fight. The river becomes a negotiation under physical pressure. This is why the post-2026 process matters. The current operating rules are expiring, and federal planners are working through new guidelines for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. That process is not a bureaucratic footnote. It is an attempt to write rules for a river whose old baseline has broken. The next rules will not simply decide how much water moves from one reservoir to another. They will decide how the system distributes risk when there is not enough water to preserve every old expectation at once. That is the real new baseline, not one dry year, not one emergency order, not one low reservoir photograph. The new baseline is a system in which every choice has a visible cost. For much of the 20th century, the Colorado River system could act as if storage was a giant shock absorber. Wet years filled the reservoirs, dry years drew them down, time was bought, growth continued. But the present system is increasingly operating like a patient with less blood volume. The heart may still pump, the organs may still function, but every stress matters more because the reserve is smaller. A hot summer matters more, a weak snowpack matters more, a reduced release matters more. A few feet at Lake Mead matter more. Hoover's Hydropower cliff is a perfect example because it shows how a gradual climate signal becomes an abrupt infrastructure consequence. The reservoir falls foot by foot. That looks gradual, but the turbine threshold is not gradual. Once the water approaches the operating line for severe cavitation risk in older units, the system can lose usable capacity in a step. The climate signal is slow. The machine response can be sharp. This pattern is appearing across the modern world. Extreme rainfall enters cities through storm drains that were designed for older storms. Heat waves enter the power grid through transformers, substations, and air conditioning demand. Drought enters agriculture through planting windows, soil moisture, irrigation schedules, and crop insurance. Sea level rise enters daily life through sewer backups, saltwater intrusion, and mortgage risk. The disaster is rarely only the headline hazard. It is the hazard finding the small technical doorway into a system people assumed was stronger. At Hoover, the doorway is hydraulic head and turbine design. That is why the story should not be reduced to whether one dam can keep producing electricity. The larger question is whether the Southwest can adapt its linked systems quickly enough. Can water use fall fast enough to stabilize reservoirs? Can the grid replace lost hydropower flexibility without raising risk during heat? Can cities grow without assuming the river will behave like it did in the past? Can agricultural systems absorb cuts without destroying communities? Can tribal rights be honored in a basin that is already overallocated? Can environmental flows survive when every drop is contested? Can old infrastructure be upgraded before the next threshold arrives? None of these questions has a simple answer, but Hoover makes them impossible to ignore. The system reaction is already showing strain. Agencies are negotiating reductions. Federal reports are modeling alternatives. Power planners are evaluating capacity. Engineers are replacing older turbines with wide head turbines. Water managers are trying to keep reservoirs above critical elevations. Cities are investing in conservation, recycling, groundwater banking, and new supply strategies. Farmers are facing pressure to use less water or change cropping decisions. The system is responding, but the response itself reveals how crowded the emergency room has become. The danger is not that nothing is being done. The danger is that everything being done may have to work at once. A wide head turbine can help Hoover operate at lower lake levels, but it cannot create snow. Conservation can slow reservoir decline, but it cannot erase decades of overuse by itself. New operating guidelines can distribute risk, but they cannot manufacture abundance. Solar and batteries can support the grid, but they must be built, connected, financed, and timed. Agricultural changes can reduce demand, but they affect workers, towns, food supply chains, and land values. Every solution is real. Every solution has limits. That is what a systems crisis feels like. Not hopelessness, but constraint. The old story of Hoover Dam was about mastery. A river was blocked. A desert was electrified. A region grew. The new story is about feedback. The atmosphere warms. Snowpack shifts. Runoff weakens. Reservoirs drop. Turbines lose head. Power output falls. Replacement costs rise. Water negotiations tighten. Cities conserve. Farms adjust. Communities absorb pressure. The system sends messages back to the people who built it. And the messages are getting harder to ignore. One message says that hydropower is not guaranteed by concrete. It is guaranteed by water at elevation. Another says that water storage is not guaranteed by reservoir size. It is guaranteed by inflow greater than demand over time. Another says that legal rights cannot make a river wetter. Another says that climate risk does not wait until infrastructure reaches zero. It arrives when margins are thin enough for ordinary stress to become abnormal. This is the difference between news and analysis. The news is that Hoover Dam is approaching a hydropower cliff near 1,035 feet. The analysis is that this cliff exposes a new operating reality for the Colorado River Basin. The system is no longer being tested only by shortage. It is being tested by synchronization. Water shortage, heat demand, turbine limits, aging infrastructure, legal negotiations, and social vulnerability are no longer separate problems. They are arriving together. That is why the phrase, new baseline, should be used carefully. It does not mean every year will be worse than the last. It does not mean the river is doomed to decline in a straight line. Wet years can still happen. Reservoirs can still rise. Conservation can still work. Engineering can still reduce damage. But the new baseline means the old recovery story is weaker. A wet year no longer automatically restores the old confidence. A full canal no longer means the system is safe. A functioning dam no longer means the margin is large. Hoover Dam still stands as one of the most powerful symbols of American engineering. But symbols can change meaning. The same dam that once represented control now represents exposure. It shows how a society can build magnificently and still become vulnerable when the climate, demand, and rules around that infrastructure shift. The hydropower cliff is not the end of Hoover Dam. It is a warning from the operating range. It says the future will not be decided only by how much water remains, but by when that water arrives, where it is stored, how high it sits, which machines can use it, who has rights to it, who pays when it fails to perform, and who is left with the least protection when the system tightens. That is the larger story. A famous dam in a desert canyon is becoming a measuring instrument for an entire region. It measures water, it measures heat, it measures engineering, it measures law, it measures inequality. It measures how much of the 20th century can still be carried into the 21st. And the reading is not finished. A story like this has to be careful, because fear can move faster than evidence. It would be easy to say that Hoover Dam is about to fail. It would be easy to say that the American Southwest is days away from losing its power. It would be easy to turn one elevation number into a countdown clock for collapse. But that would not be accurate. And if the goal is to understand the danger, exaggeration is not useful. It hides the real mechanism behind a louder but weaker claim. The first thing that is true is this. Lake Mead's elevation matters directly to Hoover Dam's power production. That is not speculation. Hydropower depends on hydraulic head, and hydraulic head depends on the height difference between the reservoir surface and the water leaving the turbines. As the lake falls, the pressure available to drive the turbines falls with it. Lower pressure changes output, efficiency, and operating range. This is basic physics, not opinion. The second thing that is true is more specific. Federal technical assessments identify 1,035 feet as a critical elevation for Hoover's older turbines. Below that level, those older units are expected to face severe cavitation damage. That does not mean Hoover Dam disappears. It does not mean no water can move through the structure. It means a large portion of the existing turbine fleet can no longer be treated as safely usable in the same way. The risk is mechanical and operational before it is cinematic. The third thing that is true is that Hoover's usable capacity can fall sharply at that point. Federal information says that at 1,035 feet, capacity could drop from an earlier estimate of about 1,302 megawatts to only about 382 megawatts, because the dam would rely mainly on the wide head turbines that can tolerate lower lake levels. That is a real cliff in usable power capability. But it is not the same as total electrical collapse across the Southwest. Grid operators have other resources. Utilities can buy replacement power. Other plants, batteries, imports, conservation programs, and market tools can help. The danger is not instant darkness. The danger is lost flexibility, higher cost, thinner margin, and more pressure during heat. The fourth thing that is true is that Lake Powell and Lake Mead are connected. When federal operators hold more water in Lake Powell to protect Glen Canyon Dam's power pool, less water may move downstream into Lake Mead. When more water is sent to Mead, Powell can face more stress. This is not a conspiracy. It is reservoir operation under shortage. The two lakes are part of one river system, and saving margin in one place can reduce margin somewhere else. But there are also things that should not be claimed. It cannot be honestly said that every foot of Lake Mead's decline is caused by climate change alone. The Colorado River Basin is shaped by drought, warming, long-term overuse, legal allocations, reservoir operations, agricultural demand, municipal growth, evaporation, snowpack variability, and decisions made by many institutions over many decades. Climate change is part of the story because warming affects runoff and increases stress. But the reservoir level on any single day is not the fingerprint of one cause. It is the result of a whole system. It also cannot be said that one hot summer, one bad snowpack, or one emergency action proves the future in a straight line. The basin can still have wet years. Snowpack can rebound. Reservoirs can rise. Conservation can help. Engineering upgrades can reduce damage. A serious analysis must leave room for variability, because the Colorado River has always been variable. The danger is not that every year must be worse than the last. The danger is that the system is now operating with less room to absorb the bad years when they arrive. It should also not be claimed that the new wide-head turbines solve the Colorado River crisis. They do not create water. They do not change the total supply of the basin. They do not erase drought, legal conflict, agricultural demand, or rising heat. What they do is narrower and important. They help Hoover Dam keep generating power more safely at lower lake elevations. They are an adaptation to a changed operating range. That makes them valuable. It also proves the old range can no longer be assumed. Another claim that needs caution is the relationship between Hoover's hydropower decline and power bills. Lower Hoover output can increase pressure on customer rates and replacement power costs. That is a real pathway. But not every bill increase in Arizona, Nevada, or California is caused by Hoover Dam. Electricity prices are shaped by fuel costs, transmission constraints, demand growth, market rules, wildfire risk, infrastructure spending, renewable integration, and many other forces. Hoover is part of the cost picture for its customers, not the only cause of every price change. The same caution applies to blackouts. Reduced hydropower can weaken grid flexibility, especially during hot periods, but it does not automatically mean a blackout will occur. Blackouts happen when many stresses align: high demand, limited supply, transmission problems, equipment failures, weather extremes, market constraints, or emergency conditions. Hoover's decline is one stressor in a wider grid. It matters because it removes or weakens a resource that can respond quickly. But it should not be presented as a single switch that turns the Southwest off. So what is only a coincidence? A hot day in Las Vegas is not automatically caused by Hoover Dam's power output. A power alert in California is not automatically caused by Lake Mead. A rise in electricity rates is not automatically caused by cavitation. A dry-looking shoreline photograph is not proof that the dam is near structural failure. These things may live in the same regional story, but they are not all direct causes of one another. What then is the real risk? The real risk is that the Colorado River system now contains more tripwires than the public can see. One tripwire is Lake Powell's minimum power pool. Another is Lake Mead's elevation near Hoover's older turbine limit. Another is the demand for electricity during extreme heat. Another is the cost of replacing lost hydropower. Another is the legal and political difficulty of reducing water use fast enough. Another is the vulnerability of low-income households, tribes, farm communities, and small agencies that have fewer buffers when systems tighten. The danger is not one line on one chart. The danger is the number of lines now close enough to matter. That is why separating fact from rumor makes the story more serious, not less. If the claim is that Hoover Dam will simply fail tomorrow, the story is dramatic but fragile. If the claim is that a falling reservoir is pushing older turbines towards severe cavitation risk, reducing usable capacity, increasing dependence on replacement power, and exposing a wider basin already under climate and water stress, the story is harder to dismiss. It is less theatrical. It is more real. The truth is not that everything is collapsing at once. The truth is that a system built to create stability is now spending more energy defending its margins. Lake Powell is defended. Lake Mead is defended. Turbines are replaced. Releases are adjusted. Negotiations continue. Customers are warned. Engineers adapt. Every action may be rational by itself. Together, they reveal a basin that has moved from ordinary management into continuous risk management. That is the honest warning. Hoover Dam is not a myth falling apart overnight. It is a powerful machine meeting a changed river. Lake Mead is not empty, but elevation matters before emptiness. Hydropower is not gone, but usable capacity can drop before the public expects it. Climate change is not the only cause, but warming makes the basin harder to operate. Engineering can help, but it cannot remove the need for less demand, smarter rules, and more realistic assumptions. The story is not that the end has arrived. The story is that the old safety margin has started speaking in numbers. At the beginning of this story, the image was simple: a famous dam, a falling lake, and a number on the wall of the desert that seems too small to threaten something so large. That image should return now, because it is the clearest way to understand what has changed. Lake Mead does not need to vanish for Hoover Dam to enter danger. The Colorado River does not need to stop flowing for the power system to lose confidence. The concrete does not need to crack for the machine inside it to become less useful. The warning is not written as a collapse. It is written as elevation. That is what makes 1,035 feet so unsettling. It is not the bottom. It is not the end. It is not the last possible drop of water behind Hoover Dam. It is a line where a world-famous power plant begins to reveal a more complicated truth. Infrastructure can lose function before it loses form. The dam can still stand. The towers can still rise. The river can still move through the canyon. But older turbines can face severe cavitation damage, and usable capacity can fall sharply, because the water no longer arrives with the pressure those machines were built to trust. This is the central message. Not that Hoover Dam is doomed tomorrow. Not that the Southwest is powerless. Not that engineering has failed. The message is colder than that. Hoover Dam is showing what happens when a system designed around stored abundance is forced to operate inside shrinking margins. The danger is not one broken part. It is the narrowing space between water supply, power demand, old machinery, legal commitments, and heat. A few feet of water become a mechanical problem. A mechanical problem becomes a power problem. A power problem becomes a cost problem. A cost problem becomes a household problem. That is the route from the reservoir wall to the room where someone is trying to sleep through a hot night. And once that chain is visible, the story can no longer be dismissed as scenery. For decades, Hoover Dam taught the public to believe in scale. Its concrete was massive. Its turbines were massive. Its reservoir was massive. The entire project seemed to say that if a society built big enough, carefully enough, and boldly enough, nature could be made predictable. That was the old promise of the dam. A river turned into schedule, power, water, and growth. But the new lesson is not about size. It is about thresholds. A large reservoir can approach a small technical line. A huge dam can depend on the behavior of microscopic vapor bubbles. A regional power system can feel the loss of machines hidden behind concrete. A basin serving more than 40 million people can be forced to negotiate over inches, feet, release volumes, and operating rules. The larger the system becomes, the more dangerous its small weak points become. At Hoover, that weak point is not dramatic. It is the relationship between falling water and turbine design. It is the pressure inside a penstock. It is the older runner, facing cavitation. It is the difference between nameplate capacity and usable capacity. It is the moment when water is present, but no longer present in the right way. That phrase matters, the right way. The future of water and power in the Southwest will not be decided only by whether there is water. It will be decided by where that water is stored, how high it sits, when it arrives, who has rights to it, which machines can use it, and what must be sacrificed to keep critical reservoirs above critical lines. A wet year can still come. A strong snowpack can still lift hope. Conservation can still protect storage. New turbines can still preserve generation at lower levels. But none of those facts restore the old illusion that the system has endless room. The room is smaller now. That does not mean despair is the right response. Despair is too simple. Hoover Dam is not a corpse of the 20th century. It is still working. Engineers are adapting it. Widehead turbines can help. Water managers can reduce demand. Cities can conserve. Farmers can change practices with support instead of punishment. The grid can add storage, transmission, demand response, and cleaner, flexible resources. The basin can write rules that are more honest about the river that actually exists. But hope has to be disciplined by physics. No treaty can make water fall with more pressure than its elevation allows. No speech can make a turbine safe outside its operating range. No legal promise can force a warmer, drier basin to produce the runoff of an older climate. The next chapter will depend on whether institutions can move as clearly as engineers do when a machine reaches its limit. Engineers see a threshold and redesign the part. Societies often see a threshold and argue about whether it is real. Hoover Dam has already answered that question. The threshold is real. The choice is what kind of future is built around it. If the lesson is ignored, the basin will keep treating each crisis as separate. Lake Powell will be one emergency. Lake Mead will be another. Hydropower will be another. Heat will be another. Agriculture will be another. Tribal rights will be another. City growth will be another. But the river is not separating them. The river is connecting them. It is carrying the consequences from snowpack to reservoir, from reservoir to turbine, from turbine to grid, from grid to bill, from bill to family, from family to politics. If the lesson is understood, then Hoover Dam becomes more than a warning. It becomes a measuring instrument for the new century. It tells the Southwest that adaptation cannot only mean emergency action after the water has fallen. It must mean reducing demand before the threshold, upgrading machinery before the damage, protecting vulnerable households before bills rise, and writing water rules before the next crisis forces them into existence. This story began with a hydropower cliff, but the cliff is not only at Hoover Dam, it is wherever an old assumption meets a new climate. It is in a drainage pipe sized for yesterday's rain. It is in a transformer built for yesterday's heat. It is in a reservoir rule written for yesterday's runoff. It is in a crop calendar built for yesterday's snowmelt. It is in every place where a system still looks solid from the outside, while the operating margin inside is being erased. That is why the final image should not be a dry lake bed. It should be the pale ring on the canyon wall above Lake Mead, the exposed record of water that used to be there. That ring is not just a stain, it is a memory of a different operating range. Below it, the present reservoir waits. Below that, turbines turn inside Hoover Dam. And inside those turbines, the future is being negotiated by pressure, metal, and falling water. The event will move. The lake may rise or fall. The exact number on the chart will change. But the lesson will remain. A society does not discover infrastructure risk only when something breaks. Sometimes it discovers risk when a machine still runs, but with less freedom, less force, and less room for error. Hoover Dam is still standing. That is not the question. The question is whether the systems built around it can change before the next few feet decide what kind of power, water, and confidence the Southwest can still afford.